Hey, friends, I'm Otis Gibbs, and this is my buddy Bill Demain. He's going to share a story about Merle Haggard.
I interviewed him for a feature called Legends of Songwriting for Performing Songwriter magazine before they went under. And it was a phoner, so I didn't get to actually sit down with him. But still, I was thinking about this the other day. There's certain voices when they come on the telephone. You know, I've interviewed Ray Charles, for example. As soon as you hear that voice, it's like, oh my God, that's Ray Charles. I interviewed Barry Gibb last week. As soon as you hear that voice, you know. And Merle Haggard was the same way. It was just that kind of weathered, seen it all, country voice, and it's unmistakably Merle Haggard, you know. We talked a lot about the 60s and 70s, which was kind of, for me, the golden period of Merle. And one story that really is memorable for me is, you know, early on in Merle's life, he was in and out of reform schools and, you know, was always truant at school and getting in trouble. And he was put in San Quentin when he was a teenager for a armed robbery attempt at a restaurant that went awry, you know. And in his first or second year at San Quentin, Johnny Cash came to the prison to perform. And, you know, Merle was already playing guitar and singing and writing songs. And I think, you know, he told me that seeing Johnny in that context was so significant to him that he kind of resolved in the moment, you know, I've been sentenced to 10 years, but I'm gonna get out earlier on good behavior and pursue a career. So after Johnny's performance, Merle was one of the inmates that got to meet him, you know. And I guess, you know, Johnny, being Johnny, said some nice, encouraging things to him. And Merle took it to heart, and he got out of prison about 2 or 3 years later. And as we know, started to pursue a career out of Bakersfield and signed to Capitol in the mid-'60s. Fast forward to 1969, Merle is a guest on the Johnny Cash show. And they're backstage before the taping, and Merle says, John, you're not going to remember this, I'm sure, but we met a long time ago at San Quentin. Johnny's like, what are you saying? I said, yeah, I was doing time. I was in the prison. And Johnny, without missing a beat, said, okay, we're going to talk about this on the show tonight. Because if we talk about it and people find out in a very sort of measured way, you know, with you, you know, explaining it all, it won't be something sensational that tabloids can pick up on and use against you. And Merle told me he was kind of doubtful about it. He said, I don't know if this is a good idea. But Johnny, again, you know, just seized on the moment. They talked about it. And this was, you know, with the Johnny Cash show, they were on a 2-second lag for any kind of things that might be bleeped out or censored. The producers had no idea that this was coming, you know. So here's Johnny like, Merle, we met before, didn't we? You know, at San Quentin prison. And Merle talks about, you know, doing time and getting arrested. But Merle said that really Johnny was right, because the fact that he talked about it on the show, people accepted it. It was never a kind of hidden skeleton in the past, you know. I thought that was really beautiful that Johnny recognized that in a way that he could help Merle, you know, sort of get over this little possible snafu in his career, you know. Also, Merle was really outspoken, as he could be, about things like amphetamines. You know, he was not shy about saying that he used a lot of amphetamines in the mid-'60s. And he said he couldn't deny that it really helped him as a songwriter, because he said it just gave me a boost of energy and focus. You know, it was one thing to use amphetamines to stay awake on the road when you're driving from gig to gig. But he said, I would not have been as prolific as a songwriter and as good as a songwriter without amphetamines. And then he went one step further, and he said, you know, all these guys today like Jason Aldean, you know, and they would probably do a whole lot better if they were taken amphetamines. So there were those moments in the interview where Merle was being Merle, like kind of pushing the envelope, where it's just that's great copy for a Q&A in a magazine. Anyway, I regret that I never got to meet him, but I'm so glad that I got to talk to him. Especially 10 months later, he was gone. So just to get to spend a half an hour on the phone with the legend was really meaningful.
So if you were going to listen to some Merle Haggard right now, what would you go to?
I would go to the Swingin' Doors album in 1966. Just, all of that Capitol stuff that he did with Ken Nelson, mid-60s, to me is just flawless. It's the best. It's really the best country music, or my favorite country music. The best is subjective.
Why do you think that stuff is so different than what was coming out of Nashville right then?
That's a good question. I mean, I always think of Merle and Buck Owens as being a little bit more rock and roll and aggressive, especially with the sound of the Telecaster, just kind of biting. And also, I remember talking to Merle about this too. I said, what made the Bakersfield sound different than the Nashville sound? And he said it was the twang of the guitars, but it was also the fact that we were coming out of really noisy clubs, working man's clubs in Bakersfield, so we had to be able to cut through the noise. And that's one of the reasons that you have that harmony sound that Buck and Don Rich were so famous for, but Merle too, So I think those two elements, aside from the songs just were a little bit more tough and real, especially with Merle. But that biting guitar and those real high harmonies, it just they used to call it Nashville West, but really it was its own thing. Bakersfield had its own identity.
What was he promoting to do this interview?
That's a great question. I want to say he had a record to promote. I can't think of any other reason that he would have done an interview. It wasn't like he was being inducted. He'd won all the awards by then and been in all the Hall of Fames. So I think it might have been his last studio album. But again, I don't remember the title of it, or I don't remember.
It's a lot of articles.
Yeah, it's a lot of articles ago. Yeah. I was in New York City, I remember, when he passed. Part of my other professional life is I'm a songwriter, and it must have been 2016 or 17. I had co-written a record with Teddy Thompson and Kelly Jones called Little Windows, and they were touring for it, and I went up to New York City to see a couple of their gigs. And we were all together. The gig had finished, and we were going out for a drink, and somebody got it on their phone that Merle passed. So all of us loved Merle, so we kind of had a little chance to grieve for him that night.
Do a toast for Merle?
Yeah, a toast for Merle.
The article that you're doing.
Yeah, I could just set up the article for Mojo.
That's cool.
What their intention was in my trip.
Is that a Don Ho?
It's a Don Ho. I've had that for years. I bought that at a thrift store like 20 years ago. It's just one of those things that surprisingly has not broken like most of the glasses that I have, Yeah, Don Ho. Never got to interview Don Ho.